Okay, everyone, we'd like to welcome you back to our boot camp. And now I have the honor of introducing Dr. Antoine Perry. He is going to be speaking to you this evening about emotional intelligence. And I'd like to turn it over. Dr. Perry, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm glad you have been able to join us this evening as we learn more about multiple intelligences. And I want to focus on a specific area of a multiple intelligence that I don't believe we give enough attention, but particularly as relates to our career and our area of professionalism, emotional intelligence tends to be very important. So the first thing I want to show you here, this was in Forbes, on Forbes.com, and this is from November 9th, 2020. It says the current challenges that CEOs are facing in 2020 make emotional intelligence more important than ever before. Companies and their stakeholders are affected every day by the volatility created by the pandemic, racial inequality, economic and social uncertainty, and other global and local systemic issues. CEOs are often some of the smartest and most driven people we know, but during difficult times, they need to tap into not only their IQ, but also their EQ, so they can more effectively lead, build relationships, and ensure support and alignment throughout the organization and with key stakeholders. So as we consider emotional intelligence and coming from a standpoint of CEOs, I want that to be the framing of our conversation. That if we were to approach our lives, if we were to approach our careers from the lens of a CEO, what makes an effective CEO? And for many, it is that they have what we call emotional intelligence. So I do have a video that we'll be able to share in the chat afterwards. Having a little sound issue, so I can't play it right now. But that is Warren Buffett, who talks in the video about you can have 160 IQ, but if you don't have EQ or a emotional quotient, that you will not be as effective as you should be. That's Warren Buffett at the top. That's Jeff Bezos, and this is Indra Sui. These are individuals who are on a list of CEOs who are ranked as having some of the highest levels of emotional intelligence. And essentially having emotional intelligence, we'll get into this a little bit more, but emotional intelligence is just that, having the ability to be aware of your own emotions and feelings, but also being able to recognize that into other people. And whenever I do presentations, I often sprinkle them with stories. I will say that with Warren Buffett, I have secondhand, almost firsthand experience in knowing of his emotional intelligence. But in 2015, I was living in Virginia, and I was working at a community college. I've worked in higher education most of my career. And we had a donor who wanted to give a few $1 million to the college and create a program. And they picked a few folks from the college to attend this meeting at the home of this donor. So I get into the home, and it's the home of a Doris Buffett. And Doris Buffett, she passed away last year, but Doris Buffett is or was the oldest sister of Warren Buffett. He had the older sister, Doris, and then he also has a younger sister. And in her home, she said she wanted to create this program for young people. She wanted to benefit young people. She did a lot of work on recidivism, and rather than work with individuals after they have been to prison, she said, let's prevent people from going to prison. And she believed that education was a way to do that. So went to the home of Miss Buffett, and before we did anything, she just said, okay, Antoine, so tell me your story. Like, why are you here? And, caught me a little bit off guard, because one, I was thinking, I can't believe I'm in the home of a Buffett family member. But I just talked to her, and I don't really remember what I said. I told her about my upbringing. I told her, where I grew up. But at the end of me speaking, she said, okay, I don't need to speak to anybody else. I was the first person to speak. She said, I don't need to speak to anybody else. I'm going to give the money to the college, and I want Antoine to lead this program. So after we started eating, I mustered up enough nerve to ask her why. And essentially what she told me was that in her family, particularly for her brother, herself, and also their other sister, that she has a way of understanding people's emotions as she's understood her own emotions. She's said she made a lot of mistakes in her life, but she learned from them. And she's been able to recognize those same talents and gifts in other people. And that's why she did it. So I just share that story to say that this isn't something that's just far off, words that we're sharing, that emotional intelligence is important, but these are actually practices of individuals, whether you are a Buffett or not.
Don't need.
So what is emotional intelligence? In 1990, Daniel Goleman, who right now is essentially the most foremost authority on emotional intelligence. But in 1990, Mr. Goleman, then a science reporter for the New York Times, read an article in a scientific journal that referred to EQ. He proceeded to do his own research and found that high-performing leaders were distinguished by their degree of self-awareness, their empathy, and social skills. EQ is not personality, cognitive intelligence, or aptitude. EQ is a set of emotional and social skills that help us understand ourselves and others to respond in different situations. So what I want to highlight in this particular definition of emotional intelligence is focusing on what it is not, because sometimes when I've spoken about emotional intelligence in the past, I've had individuals to say, okay, so you have to be a people person, you have to be someone who's always talking to people, but it's not really that at all. It's just really understanding who you are and your existence, but also being able to recognize that in other people. So as I just mentioned, having a high EQ doesn't necessarily mean that you are a warm and fuzzy person, but it means that you're good at paying attention to how you interact with people, how you react to you, and how to be deliberate and strategic with building relationships. So if all of us were to do a practice right now, this will probably take about 15 seconds. But I want you to think about all of the interactions that you had today, whether it be at home, whether it be with your colleagues, whether it be with your children, neighbors, family members. Just think about your interactions with them. And if you can, try to think about your existence when you were in those interactions. What was your mood? And depending on what your mood was, have you ever thought about what your facial expressions are? I know we've all had people say to us, I could tell how you were feeling that entire conversation because you had that face. That is essentially an aspect of figuring out what your emotional intelligence or how to utilize your emotional intelligence is. If you are making a face during those conversations that you have throughout the day, are you aware of the information that you're giving off during those particular interactions? So as we begin to shape and craft our lens, that's what I want you to think about as we discuss that. In terms of characteristics of emotional intelligence, Daniel Goleman identified 5 elements that make up emotional intelligence. So one, as I just mentioned, being aware, self-aware. Number 2, your self-regulation. Next, your motivation. And though he does not necessarily put these in a hierarchy, what I have found is that the last 2 are probably 2 of the most important, empathy and social skills. And we'll actually talk about those in detail. So self-awareness. Self-awareness is being self-aware means being aware of your moods as you are behaving them. So as I just mentioned a moment ago, when you have those interactions, if there are difficult conversations, easy conversations, who are you in those conversations? we can really learn about ourselves, especially if we ask other people, how do you receive me when we have specific discussions? And this is, again, helping us to shape or improve our emotional intelligence. But that will probably be a very easy way to do that, is just ask others, how do you receive me? I know many of us are in Zoom meetings a lot, or Teams meetings a lot, because we're not in person as we were prior to the pandemic. So when you're on the Zoom and you're there, I just wonder what people would say if we were to ask, how do you receive me when I am in our Zoom meetings? Or what do you receive from what I'm saying? I often tell, when I teach undergraduate students, I tell them that, the things that we don't say are speaking as loudly as the words that we use. And that all feeds into our emotional intelligence. So as it relates to being self-aware, to increase our self-awareness, we can learn from the practice of mindfulness, or also keep a journal to analyze our emotional experiences. And when we talk about being emotionally intelligent, again, it's just having a keen sense of awareness of your emotions and the emotions of others. All of us have emotions. All of us are human, so we will experience it, but there's a difference from just being emotional or having emotions to having a high emotional quotient. And at the end of this, there are lots of quizzes. You could probably do a Google search and find some. There is one that we will share at the end of the presentation, for you to get an idea of where you lie in the EQ, with your EQ number. But we all have emotions, but again, we're talking about having a high, keen sense of our emotions, and right now, self-awareness. So again, that's the first area of emotional intelligence, is being self-aware. And again, to increase that, you can look up, if you don't already practice mindfulness, that's a great way to do that, but also keeping a journal and analyzing what your emotional experiences are. The next is self-regulation. Self-regulation is about staying in control. This relies on one knowing his or her triggers. Accountability is another important element of self-regulation. Take responsibility for your actions and behaviors that align with your values. And self-regulation can sometimes be challenging. Now, for myself, I don't know if I was consciously practicing to be more emotionally intelligent, but I have just generally been a person who is very tempered, and I've been able to control my emotions. And I have taken assessments, and I tell people that I'm an emotional genius because I do have a high level of EQ. But just because I have a high level of EQ does not mean that I get all of this right all of the time. Great example. When I first started working in Washington, D.C., I was living about 60 miles south of Washington, D.C. And if you know anything about Northern Virginia and D.C. traffic, it's horrible. But I was driving 60 miles in each direction, which doesn't sound bad, but with traffic, we're talking about an hour and 45-minute drive to work, and sometimes beyond 2 hours to get home. And even though I'm a very calm and collected person, being in a car for hours at a time in traffic with people making horrendous decisions in their automobiles, I realized that I am not as calm as I thought I was. I've never been a person to use a lot of curse words. I've always just been a very chill person. But during that commute, I realized that I know curse words a lot better than I thought, because I was not able to remain in control. And what I did was I told myself, I'm so calm, I don't need to put anything in place to alleviate the stress of driving, because I was just thought that's not something that I needed. But I realized that if I didn't want to drive myself crazy every day, that I needed to move. And of course, we can't just move at the drop of a hat. So I had to put some things in place to remain calm. And one of those things is rather than leave my house at 7:30 to get to work at 9, I said, let me get up a little bit earlier and leave the house at 6:45, which allowed me to beat a lot of the rush hour traffic, which allowed me to leave work a little bit earlier to make it back home. So I still had traffic, I still had a long commute, but I was able to cut down on that commute. I also invested in audiobooks because that allowed me to have my attention. Though I was focused on the road, it allowed my attention to be on something other than why is it taking so long? Why is there another accident? So that is part of self-regulation and increasing one's self-regulation. So one had to be accountable for, my element of, as the chat mentioned, having some mini road rage moments, but to really just self-regulate so that I could remain in control, because that's very important, not only in our families, not only with children, if you have young children, but especially with our colleagues in the professional world. Having the ability to self-regulate one's emotions is vitally important, because you losing it at work could be the difference between being promoted or remaining in a position or losing your job altogether. So this third area, as we discussed, emotional intelligence, is motivation. It says, when you're distracted by your emotions, you may find it hard to see tasks through. Boost motivation by celebrating small wins and developing self-discipline. When you struggle in this area, this is a time to rediscover your purpose. So again, staying motivated. And I know when I discuss this probably sounds like it's just very common sense type of information, which it is. It's general information we're all familiar with. But as I will continue to remind you throughout the presentation, we're not talking about just being calm or just being motivated or just being able to self-regulate. We're talking about doing it to the ability where you reach a high level of EQ. CEOs, the top CEOs of Fortune 500 companies all have EQ because they know how to keep the individuals that work at their organizations motivated. They create environments that are conducive to self-regulation. They just create these environments where you want to be there, because when people are feeling good about themselves, when they're feeling motivated, when they are able to remove those things that could cause a disruption in self-regulation, for example, they know that they will get a good product and good work. Another example that I'm thinking of is a few years ago, I was able to travel to Palo Alto, California. And the group that I was with, we got a tour of the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. So that's the organization that's ran by Mark Zuckerberg's wife, founder of Facebook. So as we were there, I was marveling at my surroundings, because there was a chef who made lunch that they didn't have to pay for. And there were soft drinks and bottled water and candy and snacks all around. There were no vending machines. There were people who were working on the couch. There were people who were working at desks. There were people in cubicles. There were people who were collaborating and talking. And I just, by the end of that visit, we not only met Mark Zuckerberg, we met his wife, which was very nice, but I was more intrigued by the work environment. Again, as one who really thrives on emotional intelligence, I was just in an emotional intelligence heaven by seeing the environment that they created. Because again, they knew that if they created the right work environment, that the people who were there were going to produce great product and bring great value to their organization. So in the places that we may work or live, all of us can't be in an environment where we're getting free lunch from chefs every day. We're getting free snacks, or getting to, sit on a couch instead of sitting at our desk or cubicle. I understand that. However, what can I bring to my workspace so that I remain motivated? So that if I do interact with someone that begins to tug on my emotions and that begins to test my self-regulation, what can I bring into my own environment so that I remain motivated, that will feed into my EQ and allow me to remain emotionally intelligent? Because again, EQ and not having EQ is the difference between employment, creating businesses, having people buy into your thoughts and ideas, having sometimes successful communication in your families. Again, this is both personal and professional. But some things that we can do are, bring in music to your workspace or on your lunch, rather than just go and sit in your car or just sit at your desk. Take a walk if you enjoy being outside. I mean, whatever it's going to take for you to remain motivated to produce great work. That is the difference between those who are promoted or those who are making amazing impacts in their personal and professional lives than those who don't. So being motivated and staying motivated and boosting your motivation is very important to developing high levels of EQ. And the last sentence, which I think is very, very important here, it says, when you are struggling in this area, this may be a time to rediscover your purpose, which I'm a big advocate for us doing our best to do those things that are within our purpose. Because when we are working within our purpose, that's when we do the best work. That's when it doesn't feel like work at all. So staying motivated and aligning your purpose is very important. Next, I will say, again, the last two, which I am firm believers are two of the most important. But this to me is probably the most important personally of the five, are empathy. Empathy is the ability to recognize other people's emotions and understand their perspectives. To develop empathy, start about thinking of other viewpoints, observe others' body language. So this is an area that, as you're developing your EQ, this is something that you just through practice will have to become better at. But as I mentioned before, I started operating in EQ before I knew that I was, just from being a young person. I just was always observant of people's emotions or their body language. And it probably stemmed from my upbringing, growing up. My parents divorced when I was very young. So my mother was raising my sister and I. And you have a single mom who is not only working, making sure that her children are successful, and also helping out other family members. I know this probably sounds silly, but if I wanted, a new bike, if I wanted a video game, I would observe my mom's body language and facial expressions when she came home from work. So I could always tell if she had a good day or a bad day. Now to her, she's probably thinking, you know what, I had a rough day at work today, but I'm going to smile and I'm going to cook dinner and I'm going to help my kids with their homework. And in her mind, she probably thought that she was masking it. And with my sister may not have noticed the things that I noticed, but that's something I started to do at a very young age. I would always, when we hear her parking the driveway, I look out the window and I would always get a glimpse of her face. And that also determined how I was going to come down the stairs to greet my mom when she came home from work. And as I got older and I started to read more about emotional intelligence and moral intelligence, which all fits under the umbrella of multiple intelligences, I realized that I was actually practicing empathy before I even understood what empathy was. So again, empathy is the ability to recognize other people's emotions and understand their perspectives. So being that that's something I started to do at a young age at home with my mom, I began to do it with my sister. I began to do it with my other family members, my friends. I did it in school. And it's just a practice that now I've been doing it so long, I don't even do it consciously. But when I'm communicating with someone, even if I have on my mind something that I'm planning to say, I sometimes will change it if I can see that my message may not be received the way I want it to be received. Because, if you just think about it, if someone's upset, if someone's angry, for those of you who work in education and you're teaching, you have a lesson, you prepared, you want to teach your lesson, your English lesson, your math lesson, your literature lesson. But if a student had a rough night the night before, or a rough morning, or they're emotional about something, the message, your intended message, though you might be the most prolific professor, the most prolific lecturer, the most prolific teacher on the planet, you may not be able to have your message received in the way that it should be received, because that person has something else that's distracting them from receiving it. So being able to have empathy. And when we talk about having high levels of emotional intelligence, that's also being able to pivot. And there have been many times where I have prepared, I do a good amount of public speaking. There are times where I've prepared a particular speech that I was going to give. But once I get to the audience and I start to observe them and I start to view them, I realize that my generic message is going to have to be tailored for this particular audience. So empathy is definitely a very important aspect of emotional intelligence, and being able to recognize that in others. And again, I think that you can develop it through practice. I also believe personally that it can sometimes be inherited. And I know my grandmother, again, before I knew to call it emotional intelligence, but my grandmother had, even beyond what I have, this amazing sense of being able to understand where a person was arriving. And the greatest example, and then I'll move on, is there will be times where I would walk into my grandmother's house before I even make eye contact with her, but I would come into the house and, you know, from where her living room was to where the front door was, she couldn't see. I had a key. And I remember I would come in, my grandmother would always say, like, you know, who's that? And I'd say, it's me, Grandma. I'd say Antoine. And literally, I could try to sound chipper. I could try to smile while I'm saying it. And literally every time I was upset or dealing with something, immediately my grandmother, as I walked into the room, would say, so tell me what's wrong. And I think that's just, I know that sounds like, it's your grandma. Of course she knows you. But I really believe that it also lies into being empathetic and understanding how other people are arriving in the spaces that we're in. Oh, I left one off. Well, social skills. Because my video is not going to work. But yeah, social skills. I didn't include that on the PowerPoint by mistake. But social skills, again, I believe is one of the most, after empathy, the next most important attribute of emotional intelligence. Because it's one thing to understand how one is arriving in your space. It's one thing for them to give facial expressions or body language for you so that you can identify what that person might be feeling and understanding how to pivot. But then if you're not able to counter that with the right words, you know, you might be doing them a disservice. So having the appropriate social skills to communicate whatever it is that needs to be communicated in that moment will feed into your emotional intelligence. So I'm just going to go back just so you can see them all in one space again, and we'll go over our next activity. But again, 5 characteristics of emotional intelligence are being self-aware, being able to self-regulate, having motivation, having empathy, and then having the social skills. And again, social skills is not just speaking, but it's also, you know, the way that you arrive in a space, the way that you give eye contact, the way I'm a person who speaks with his hands, but people feed off of what you're giving out. And that's all a part of being social skills, having those social skills that feed into one's emotional intelligence. So I know I just said a lot, but I'm hoping that this is connecting with you in some way. I'm hoping it's making sense to you in some way, or at the very least, I'm hoping it has you thinking about your emotions and how you regulate your emotions and how you arrive in spaces and how you receive other people. Because some of us, I've spoken to individuals and they say, you know, if I can see someone's upset, sometimes when I'm upset, I don't like people to bother me. I like people to pretend like they don't see me upset. And I just want them to say what they want to say, which I understand. Some people are saying, well, if I'm happy and we have something planned, I just want to stop and everybody celebrate the happiness. I understand that too. But having high level of emotional intelligence is being able to determine that without having to ask. I'm going to say that again. Having a high level of emotional intelligence is being able to determine when to stop and when to start without having to ask, what is it that you want me to do? Now, part of that is listening, but that might be an opportunity for you to recognize there's something that is not as it normally is in this particular space, and to ask, are you okay? Maybe, depending on the person, it might result in, I just want to make sure that everybody's in the right space today without singling that person out. So you might say, I just want to say that, if you don't feel like sharing today, it's okay. That's giving that person a silent nod that I recognize that this might not be a great time. Or if you can see that someone is very excited about something, that's an opportunity to say, okay, we're going to move on in a moment, but does anyone have any good news to share? Now, again, those are just very small things, very simple statements. But as a person who is in front of people all the time, it's almost like I scan the room to see what my audience might be feeling, because I enjoy speaking. I do it often. I mean, I really gain energy from speaking to people, especially when we're in person. But if something is going to block you from receiving my message, I'm going to do whatever I can to try to alleviate that. So that's why emotional intelligence and those 5 areas, those 5 characteristics that I mentioned are very, very important to me. So in that practice, and there have been times where I've given speeches in front of hundreds of people, and literally as I'm speaking, I'm scanning the room to see what people's body language is, to see if they're nodding, to see if they're smiling, especially when I tell my corny jokes. Sometimes I still want to laugh, even though I know it's not that funny. But again, that's all about creating the environment. And for me, I use humor to create that environment to get my message across. So this example is, or could be, representative of the environment that I utilize when I'm giving a speech, by trying to read the room. So this is a very, very simple exercise. I have my cheat sheet right here, just because I want to make sure I give you the right answer. But if you look at this first picture right here, this face is expressing. Option A is amusement. Option B is desire. Option C is surprise. And option 4 is excitement. So, yeah, what do you think? You can, do this silently. You can just jot it down, put it in the chat. But this first picture, what emotion is that person experiencing? Amusement, desire, surprise, or excitement?
Amusement.
Now, we have amusement.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, is amusement.
If you selected amusement, if we were in person, I'd give you a prize. You're absolutely correct.
Woohoo!
It says the telltale signs of genuine amusement are the open mouth and the backwards head movement. And like a genuine smile, you can tell a genuine laugh when you see the muscles contracting around the eyes, making crow's feet. Genuine laughter often relaxes all muscle movements in the body because of shifts in our respiration patterns that happen when we laugh. This rapid shift to a state of relaxation shuts off feelings of aggression or frustration. We're cooperating with other people and not competing. So yes, okay. I feel like makeshift Who Wants to Be a Millionaire by giving all the options, but let's go to the next one. This face is expressing fear, interest, surprise, or compassion.
Surprise.
Surprise.
Surprise. If you selected surprise, you are correct. It says, surprise is often confused with fear, but when we're afraid, our lower eyelids tighten and our eyebrows look flat and tense. With surprise, our upper eyelids rise up and our eyebrows arch. Also, our jaws drop when we're surprised, but our lip corners go sideways when we're afraid, making the mouth look tighter. Some experts believe our eyes open wide like this because when we're confronted with something surprising, whether it be a long lost friend or an unexpected award, we try to absorb as much of this new information as possible. Even with me reading these, I bet you didn't realize there was so much science in facial expressions. So our next one, this face is expressing compassion, sadness, anger, or interest.
I think compassion.
I think sadness.
Yeah, I was torn.
I'm torn as well,
sadness.
Terry.
Okay, if you
I would say
chose,
sadness.
this one could be a bit difficult, but this is also true when we're dealing with individuals directly. And when we're talking about emotional intelligence, we don't always know, which will sometimes cause us to probe a bit further, even if it's nonverbal probing. But this particular example, this is compassion.
Oh,
When people feel sympathy or compassion, muscles pull the eyebrows in and up, lips pressed together, and heads tilt forward slightly, a sign of social engagement. The expression of compassion is most often confused with sadness. The eyebrow movements are similar in sadness and compassion, but with compassion, the lips press together. When we feel sad, our lips pull down. And in our last example, this face is expressing sadness.
Yeah, right. This is to my
Shame.
kids. Yeah, right. Sorry.
Right.
I
Sadness,
think you hit it right.
sadness, shame, disgust, or contempt.
Right.
So what would you say on this last one?
You said
Disgust.
sadness, shame.
Disgust or contempt?
I would say disgust in my mind.
Mhm.
This one was also a bit difficult, but this one is actually contempt.
Content, really?
No, contempt.
really?
Contempt. Okay.
Contempt.
Contempt is when you look down on someone derisively or suspiciously. What's important about the expression of contempt is that the lips tighten on one side of the face, but not the other. If the tightening were on both sides of the face, the person could be swallowing or salivating. People confuse contempt with disgust, but disgust involves the raising of the upper lip and the bridge of the nose. So the point of this particular exercise is when we are interacting throughout our day, we may have these emotions and we may experience these emotions in other people. However, if we go back to practicing emotional intelligence, most people, unless they know us extremely well, most people should not be able to, well, perhaps not amusement, but when we are disgusted or when we're sad, or if we're afraid, self-regulation is about not hiding or masking those emotions, but being able to regulate so that you are experiencing those emotions in a way that you control, that you don't feel out of control. There are some times that even people with high levels of EQ can't control it. I don't like roller coasters. So if I'm on a roller coaster, no matter how much I talk to you about EQ, you're going to see that I am afraid, that I am disgusted, and that I am contemptuous all at the same time. I don't like haunted houses. People like to go to them because they're fun, but I just don't like being afraid. I don't like to put myself in situations that I'm going to be afraid. So again, it doesn't mean that you won't ever operate in those emotions. But again, going back to our 5 characteristics, definitely being able to self-regulate is important. But again, as you interact with other people, try to understand how they're arriving in your space and what emotion they are experiencing when you're with them, because it can make the difference or make or break a positive relationship.
Right.
So using EQ in your professional life, and this is a testimonial of someone. It says, when a leader needs to correct the performance of a team member, that member may get defensive and react in ways that could be inappropriate or rude. The leader needs to call upon their own EQ to diffuse the anger and frustration, but also ensure that the subordinate understands what is being asked of them. The ability to deliver bad news without causing a scene is an art that EQ goes to the heart of. Another recurring theme is a team member who is a great performer, such as an outstanding salesperson, but who consistently leaves other people in the organization feeling diminished or insulted. These toxic team members have the ability to call upon enough EQ to close a deal, but are sensitive to the damage they leave around them. So in this particular example, and most of us at some point in our professional career, or maybe even in our personal lives, have had people tell us things that we probably weren't prepared or didn't want to hear. But if you can understand that it's only natural for individuals to become defensive, how can we use our EQ to still deliver the message that we need to deliver without the person feeling defeated at the end of it? Part of that is using our EQ. And in a practice that I share with undergraduate students often is using I statements versus you statements. I know that's very simple. Even at home or with family members, I try to say, I always say I feel, because having, saying to someone, you don't care about the job that you're doing gets a different response from I don't understand where you're aligned as it relates to your professional abilities. Like those are the same message, but it's delivered in two different ways. And even having a desire to deliver that message in a way that it's not going to cause the person to be defensive is showing that you're tapped into your emotional intelligence. My favorite example of emotional intelligence is knowing not to fire off an email response when you're hot over the topic or situation. Don't swoop and lose the trust of whoever is on the other end. Take time, self-regulate, and be aware of all the facts and details in whatever situation you're responding to. You will regret hitting the send button at some point if you're not in control and measured in your reactions. So again, I probably haven't had this happen as much, but there have been many times where you did something that you were supposed to, and for whatever reason, it wasn't received or it didn't make it to the person it was supposed to, and they've emailed you, why didn't you do this? Or you were supposed to do this and you didn't. Like immediately, you want to pull out all of your proof and send it immediately. But rather than do that, try to be a part of the solution and to find out where the breakdown is, especially if you know it's something that you did. And something that I do, I have received, very terse emails asking for things, especially when I know that I produced what I'm supposed to produce. But rather than respond to that person in the way that they, reacted to me, I used my emotional intelligence and I set the tone, which is very important when we're talking about EQ. Rather than just surviving in whatever environment you're in, having high levels of EQ allow you to take control of the situation and conduct meetings and have conversations where you're resetting the tone, especially if it's starting off at a negative place. So that's, again, tap to your EQ when you are, replying to email, especially if it's in the area of something that you know that you've done and you're being questioned on it. And then in our last example, saying, hold on, give me a minute to collect myself before I respond, please, or asking a coworker or boss, your face indicates you might be concerned, even upset about this development. Is that true? Are ways you can employ emotional intelligence in a highly charged situation, but that will help you assess out the problem and develop solutions. In addition to being more direct and specific with coworkers, take time to meditate. Meditating, especially meditations where you mentally scan your body, noting where you're holding stress, helps you improve your ability to balance charged emotions while making clear decisions. So again, especially when things are tense, meditating could just be taking a moment for yourself, breathing, taking a walk. If you're, working back in your office, going to the water fountain, just having a moment to collect. Or what I sometimes recommend is go to the bathroom and just look in the mirror. And because, when you go back to solve a problem or you want to find a solution, you want to make sure that you're not bringing the negative energy that you may have been met with. And again, when I speak about EQ, is setting the tone, being self-regulated, being able to have those social skills, being able to pivot. So you just want to make sure, if you know that you have a trigger that's shorter than someone else's, you know what, can we talk in about 5 minutes? Or can you give me just a moment? I really wanted to think about this, so I want to look through my files to see where we are. And that can definitely help diffuse the situation. And EQ, though the only use of it is not to diffuse tense situations, it can definitely be very helpful in doing so. So lastly, I just ask you a few questions before we close out, just to have you, think, process, brainstorm about some of these as we think about EQ. But if there's anyone who wants to share, how can you use emotional intelligence in your own career or vocation, or even at home, but just in life? How do you think you personally could benefit from the use of emotional intelligence?
That's actually a great question. It's so funny because I keep thinking back to mindset, as you've mentioned, within the mindfulness, a piece of it. And as I continue to do better with it from a career perspective, I know that I need to, from a parent perspective and at home, continue to improve upon it. So it's very interesting that now I'm more cognizant of it, but I still have to continue to improve upon it. So I'm just kind of at that point where I'm even better at understanding where I am there at work, but at home, just have to get better. It's amazing how different though the level can be, as you said, the triggers, right?
Absolutely.
So yeah, that's something where I know I need to continuously improve.
And I know, oh yes, go ahead.
I was
found
gonna say,
interesting. Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
no. Go. Your turn.
I was integrating your data and facts into the intelligences and wondering how they connect. And it's because number one, and you said it also, you had already an emotional quotient or knowledge abilities before you recognized it. So it means it's a gift that we all have in some ways, number one. Number two, so that would be on the basal right side, where I have demonstrated where possibly the emotional intelligence is located. However, you also need to have self-awareness at the same time, which is what I have integrated in the basal left of the limbic brain. And then you need to be able to think about it. Which means now, like just what Terry said, we need now to go into our frontal lobes, so to say, and think about it, and then design a better or more suitable reaction. So that's what I really, so EQ is much more than just one dot in the 8. It's actually a progressive capacity that we have, and then we can further develop by looking at ourselves and then integrating it into our specific environment and then improving on it. So that I found that interesting.
Absolutely.
I was just going to mention that EQ, as you can tell from my answers to those pictures, can be a bit of a challenge sometimes. Understanding and stepping into someone else's shoes. We haven't all lived the lives of others, right? So we're going to come across people that we don't understand, for whom we don't have insights. And so I think a general rule that at least helps me is just try to be kind. Try to treat people fairly. Try to treat people well, even if you don't understand where they're coming from. The last thing you want to do is be negative or hurtful or mean or in some way cause harm. So I just know, as somebody who struggles to understand EQ, who wants to be better at EQ, that even if I don't understand it, at least I can be kind.
Absolutely. And definitely, to go back to something Ua said, even though we're measuring, you measure EQ differently than one does IQ. However, it does take an ability, and I would even argue it does take an intellectual ability to be able to recognize the emotions and feelings of others, and then being able to process that literally in the moment to know how to respond. So I'm definitely, that's why I appreciated his presentation, where he lets us know like where those things come from and where in the brain those thoughts develop and how those reactions are coming together. Because I definitely believe it's an intellectual ability to do that we measure in a different way. And then also, as Terry mentioned, I practice EQ a lot, but I don't have children. I practice EQ with adults and young adults. So I feel like I've mastered that, but I am recently engaged, and my beautiful fiance has a 4-year-old son. And I realized that the EQ that I utilize with adults and college students, that I am not as skilled as I thought I was when I'm talking about EQ of interacting and engaging with a 4-year-old, who is also an extremely intelligent 4-year-old. So that's, an area that I'm still practicing at home. And then, as Mindy mentioned, and something I try to do, and I remind myself of this all the time, we never know what a person has experienced before they arrive at us. And especially if we are people that are consciously aiming to be kind and pleasant, if we encounter someone who's just very angry or very contemptuous or very rude, sometimes it's easy to write them off as they're just angry, rude, contemptuous people. But practicing EQ lets me know that we're human, and to be innately human is to be kind, is to care about your fellow brother or sister on the planet. So if a person is arriving in that space, it is because they have experienced something before arriving to me that has caused them to be that way. Whether they experienced it 10 minutes before, or whether they've been experiencing it 10 years before, up to the time they meet me. When we think about that, that's, again, practicing EQ. So doing something very simple as, when I go to the store and I encounter someone, I'm about to park, they pull in front of me, they give me the finger, I could just say, you know what, they're just really angry people. But I could also say, wow, I don't know what that person experienced before they got here. I'm not saying it's easy to do that every time, but that is, again, tapping into EQ to try to determine where they might be. And that helps me to, cater my thoughts as I relate to them.
Yeah, and what I would like to add to it is the cerebral brain, so the frontal lobes, are only developed till age 25, which means anything below that age is subtraction from our ability to what you just said, to recognize the thing and then to react in Mindy's way, of course, be kind, but if you take, let's say, a 16, 17-year-old person who is always exploding anyway, no ability, the research actually says they need to live out this part of their emotional intelligence, whether it's good or bad at this point, as long as it's not destructive, of course. What I used to do as a PE teacher a long time ago, when you had this, I was like maybe 26 to 28 and fully, muscled. When I went through the halls and some of those big boys came and just, gave me the shoulder or something, I invited them for a little game of handball, the European handball or rugby. I preferred rugby in the gym. And then we had a good opportunity to live out our emotional abilities right there. That gained respect because they suddenly knew they couldn't do what they wanted to do just like that because they thought they were stronger or whatever. But they actually recreated a relationship like that. And as long as it was not harmful, of course, and or malicious in that way. So there are two things to it. What I'm really learning about it, and I learn it again and again that our ability to self-reflect and then to adjust in a way that is most appropriate and successful for all parties involved is a function of our ability to think, if you want to, because emotions, they just come, they are there. If you control them in a way that they go away, you actually eliminate a human part in us that we share with dogs and donkeys. I think I learned that when I had a few months of guest dog, my daughter's, my wife's oldest daughter. She brings also, and Way also receives us when we come home after 2 or 3 hours of absence. Is just something all humans should learn. It's like, and then jumps up and down. Is so happy when it's just incredible. And my wife and I, we're actually imitating this now. Also, just for the fun of us, it's like when we come back home after a long time. A long time, like half a day or something, And so management of your EQ is a fascinating thing when you're able to do that.
Absolutely. And I will say, so we're going to skip question 2 for now. For question 3, I don't want you to answer out loud. I just want you to think about it. So think about the best positions that you've ever had. And when you think about that, what was present? What was the culture? What was the atmosphere? Why do you believe that was, if we think about like our best jobs, why was it your best job? Like what was happening? So I just want you to think about it. And as you think about it, I want you to then look at question 4 and think about the worst job that you had, or the worst manager, or the worst supervisor. Comparing it to the best position you had, and you think about the worst, what was missing? Why was it the worst? What was that supervisor or manager lacking? And if someone wants to share.
I have one. I think, and not that it's the worst person, but she just doesn't have the skills developed. She would use public humiliation on members of her team. So she wouldn't have a private conversation with someone about an issue. She would do it publicly in front of the entire team. And it just it caused anxiety, fear. People didn't disclose what they really authentically thought or who they were. They didn't take risks. There was no creativity. And it was just incredibly toxic. And I mean, it just seems like that's leadership 101. And this is still a person in a fairly high level position, and she continues to do it. And it makes me really sad.
For me, I'm thinking back because I feel like I've had the same as Mindy was describing, but also I've had the supervisor that forgets about our life outside of the workplace. And, when you think about your children, and I often think back now that I'm as a single parent, often thinking back to the students and things we worked with and trying to empathize what they're going through. And there's been the supervisors that don't really care about that, and so I would say for me, it was probably that perspective. And it didn't even have to be with me. It was with other team members, that's what I think that person was lacking, that empathy to understand. So
my best position was in the Philippines, in Manila. I was asked by the German government to develop the Eurocampus, and it's like those Californians went to find gold somewhere and found it, kind of a feeling. I was so thrilled to every morning, early morning, I had breakfast with the French headmaster, and we shared our two cultures, and in French and in German. He spoke fluently German, I spoke fluently French. We created a culture of exchange where French students went into our classes and vice versa. And it was really heaven. Not to say that it wasn't difficult, because I mean, the German mothers wanted to throw the French cook into his own pot and cook him because they didn't like this food, and the German and the French didn't like the way the German meals came out and those kinds of things. But you know, or Christmas is Moulin Rouge in Alcazar for the French. You know, they are dancing on the stage, and the Germans are sitting in front of their candlelight. You know, those things. But Antoine, that's also it can be very difficult once you go inside and you understand the background of it on both sides. You go really deeply in, then you know how to handle those situations, and you just separate the French and the German Christmas festival, and you invite each other. And if you don't want to come to those stupid Germans, then you can have your Alcazar at home. I mean, really, kind of a thing, you know. I thought long and hard what my worst position is, which I really hate or hated. And worst position I have right now is when I have to sit at the front office of our dental office and do the data entry and those kinds of things. And the only way I can circumvent this is having a good chat with the patients coming in or share stories. And so I'm so not somebody who sits behind a desk and does just this. Seriously. Fortunately, my lovely wife understands that, and I'm still helping. I'm still sitting there 3, 4, 5 hours a day, but it's like really not easy. So I was also happy when Abdi approached me and said, "Come on, let's do something about, you know, educational brokership." Yeah, and I have no idea how I love to jump on board, you know, because you need to go where you belong. And that is the expression of your preferred mental preference. And then you find your passion and revived, and you find it in situ, so to say, as the medical doctors say. That's where you are. And the outcome of that is I have left 2 schools that I developed with really staff sitting there at the conference table and crying because I left. I said, "Mr. Gemma, thank you so much. We learned so much we know how to do, but we don't want to let you go." And I had the same feeling till today. You know, it's like wonderful events that you can have when you are where you belong.
Right. Absolutely. And one of the reasons why I ended with that particular question is because when we think about it, though we all should practice our EQ, sometimes we may be in work environments where those who are managing or supervising us don't have highest levels of EQ. When you think if you're in that role, that's something you should tap into. However, that also reminds me that regardless of who we work alongside, who we work with, who we work for, it never stops us from practicing and developing our own EQ, because that is, again, it not always, but it can definitely help the environment when we practice something that may not be practiced by those who manage or lead us. So again, this was just an introduction to emotional intelligence. I just want to remind you that the characteristics of being emotionally intelligent are being self-aware, being able to self-regulate, being able to motivate, have empathy, and then have the social skills to deliver on all of that. It's a practice that you have to continue to stay at. I don't ever believe you get to a place where you say, "I've reached the top. I'm the most emotionally intelligent I will ever be," because I actually practice and I aim to get better each and every day. But just to give you an idea of where you are now, we will put in the chat a link to a emotional intelligence quiz that will give you an idea of where you are now. And then from there, you'll be able to develop some ways to help increase your levels of self-awareness and regulation, empathy, and those things. But that was my introduction to EQ.
Thank you for that, Dr. Perry. Mr. Lejavardi, I'm going to let you go ahead and speak to everyone.
Thank you very much, Dr. Perry. This was wonderful. I appreciate your work, and I have to tell you, more than anything else, I appreciate you, and we're honored to have you as one of our colleagues. I was fulfilled. I learned quite a bit, and I know we all have to become better in our emotional intelligence, not only for us to live happier, but to, more importantly, make sure that people that we claim that we love them, they can be happier because we are more aware and compassionate about others. I can mention to you that as a professional, we continuously have to strive to be better in everything. But when we are passionate about what we do, and you, Dr. Perry, are a good example of a great teacher, and your passion is always evident, then it's much easier to excel and improve. So thank you so much, and I appreciate it. I enjoyed it very much.
Yes. Wonderful. Thank you. So with that, what we could do is we can take a little break, or we can go ahead and let everyone know that, of course, we will be doing the series monthly, and we would love to have you join this wonderful group of people that we have here and share your experiences and share your growth and develop as a better person. And with that, I think we're going to go ahead and end this evening's session. If you're interested, we do have another boot camp tomorrow evening, March 26th. And we also have sessions on Saturday, the 27th, and then 2 sessions on Sunday, the 28th. So please, we would invite you to join us. We will be posting this information for you to review at a later time. And we thank you and have a wonderful evening.